There was another guy too that advocated for victims, and it was through the research he was doing, Richard Sipe, and I didn't even know this guy existed because I can't speak for everyone who grew up in my generation, born in the early '90s, but I think of the bombshell sort of like journalistic research drop on the church as being the 2002 Boston Globe. But then even before that, in 1990, you had this guy Richard Sipe, who was a psychotherapist, a former priest, and I'll just read the excerpt from the book that sort of introduces Sipe. But you write that Sipe had concluded that the church's determined portrayal of the priesthood as a brotherhood of men who readily accepted celibacy had always been a myth. He estimated that at least half of all American priests were sexually active during some or all of their careers. At any given time, he said at least 20% of the nation's priests were engaged in a sexual relationship with a woman. He believed another 20% were gay or inclined to homosexuality, and at least half of them were having sex with other men. Only 2% of the priests he studied achieved happy celibate lives. His most frightening finding was that 4 to 6% of the nation's priests were pedophiles and molested children, mostly boys. Because the church had never dealt honestly with the problem, the priesthood had turned into a perverse, quote, secret society in which these men kept each other's secrets, even if that meant covering up for sexual predators. This was in 1990. I had no idea that the sort of like this definitive research had existed for this long. Why did it take so long for people's like Sipes research to be acknowledged by the church?
Well, I think in many ways the church, even to this day, doesn't fully acknowledge that research. But, the history of the church is that it tried to pretend that this crisis didn't exist. It tried to pretend for decades, for centuries in many ways. And when it finally overwhelmed the church with the Boston Globe stories in 2002, it's been grappling with this problem ever since. Sipe, a devout Catholic who remained a devout Catholic even after he left the priesthood, was a psychotherapist used by the church. He treated troubled priests for years and years and years. And in 1990, after 25 years of studying this subject, he produces this definitive research saying this is a terrible problem. The church is not dealing with it appropriately. It's going to produce a scandal that may even imperil the survival of the church. And he is still largely ignored, even though his research turns up in courthouses around the country as victims come forward to sue the church over their abuse.
So does the like what is the church say publicly during the time of the research being built in the '80s, the '90s it's dropped all the way up to the Boston Globe article in 2002. Is the party line from the church just we're gonna say nothing? Do they say it's lies? Like what's the sort of like the generic response anytime research like this came up or testimony?
Well, for decades they wanted to ignore it. They claimed that Sipe was. I think that, the church tried to denounce Sipe's research. They said that, that priests were no more likely to be child abusers than bankers or doctors or lawyers, even though the numbers suggest that's not true. It's a particular problem in the Catholic priesthood, and even to this day, I still find men in the church hierarchy who insist that this is not true, that Sipe had it wrong, and that, again, this is a problem grossly overstated by especially by American, journalists. This also raises one thing the church does also not want to address is whether or not it should revisit the question of whether priests should be celibate. This is not something I understood going into this project, but, for the first 1,000 years of the history of the Catholic Church, priests got married, they had kids, they knew the comfort and the chaos of a family, and it was one strong-willed pope at the 11th century who declared that from that moment on, all priests had to be celibate, even though, again, the Gospels say nothing about celibacy. Jesus didn't demand it of the apostles, but this one pope in the 11th century decided that all priests and bishops must be celibate, and I certainly have come to think that perhaps this crisis of child abuse has something to do with this discipline of celibacy that was imposed on all priests, 1,000 years ago.
So you think it may be these perverse drives being acted on by priests may be sort of sparked by the discipline that the church, at least externally, demands from people who enter the priesthood. For some
Well, you know,
people.
for most of the church's history, priests, seminaries were, you know, teenagers went to seminaries. The decision to become a priest was made in their teenage years. And for you to tell a very young man that he will have no physical, intimate contact for the rest of his life, you would think that for some young men that would produce over time a mental health crisis, and perhaps that has something to do with the fact that this child abuse problem became a special problem within the Catholic priesthood. It does exist in other professions, but it seems to be really pronounced in the Catholic priesthood.
Hey guys, if you like this clip, there's a lot more waiting for you. Join the Zach Show 2.0 to unlock the full video and audio version of this episode, plus bonus content you won't find anywhere else. Exclusive AMAs, the entire back catalog of premium episodes, and the ability to submit topics and questions for future shows. Subscribe today at thezachshow.supercast.com. I'll see you there.